The workshop that refused to die. By the time the first light reached Mercer Street, the neighborhood was already awake in its own tired way. A garbage truck groaned around the corner. A bakery's exhaust fan pushed warm air into the cold morning. Across the street, a mechanic rolled open his garage door with a metallic rattle that echoed between rows of aging brick buildings. Only one building remained silent. Its faded sign still read Mercer Precision Works, though nearly every letter had peeled away under decades of rain and summer heat. The front windows were coated with dust so thick they reflected the sky instead of revealing what lay behind them. Rust climbed the steel shutters. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete. Someone had spray-painted "Just Tear It Down" across one side wall months ago, and no one had bothered to cover it. People had stopped wondering what the place had once been. Now it was simply part of the scenery. "If that building ever falls over," joked the owner of the tire shop one morning, "it'll probably improve property values." The others laughed. Not because they were cruel, because the workshop looked like the kind of place that had already surrendered years ago. Yet every weekday, precisely at 5:42 a.m., before the city fully woke, an old blue pickup eased into the narrow alley behind the building. The driver climbed out slowly. Elias Mercer wasn't a man people noticed unless they were looking for him. 63 years old, broad-shouldered despite the years, he moved carefully, favoring his left knee when the weather turned damp. His work jacket had been repaired so many times that the patches were older than some of the people passing him on the sidewalk. Deep lines crossed his hands, small pale scars left by hot steel, sharp edges, and decades of precision work. He carried the same dented metal lunchbox every morning. No briefcase, no toolbox, just the lunchbox and a ring of old brass keys. Without looking toward the street, he unlocked a plain side door hidden in the alley. The door closed behind him. Then the building became silent again. At least, that's what everyone believed. Around 9 each evening, when traffic faded and storefront lights blinked off one by one, another sound quietly emerged from inside Mercer Precision Works. Not the harsh roar of modern factory equipment, not grinding, not hammering. Instead, careful rhythms, a slow-turning spindle, the whisper of sharpened steel meeting brass, the measured click of a micrometer closing. Sounds too deliberate to belong to someone merely passing time. If anyone noticed them, they rarely mentioned it. People hear what they expect to hear. They expected an old man refusing to let go of the past. Nothing more. 24-year-old Noah Brooks loaded parcels into his delivery van while checking addresses against his handheld scanner. Most of his route never changed. Hardware store, dentist, insurance office, bakery. Then an unfamiliar package appeared on the screen. Mercer Precision Works, rear entrance, signature required. Noah frowned. "I thought that place was abandoned." His supervisor shrugged. "Scanner says it's active." Parking behind the workshop felt strangely different from driving past the front. The alley was cleaner than expected. Someone had recently swept the concrete. Stacks of hardwood crates sat neatly beneath a weatherproof tarp. Even the gutters had been cleared of leaves. It didn't match the neglected face of the building. Noah knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. As company policy, he tried the handle. Locked. He sighed and started filling out a missed delivery notice. Then, from somewhere inside, came the soft scrape of footsteps. The side door opened only a few inches. Elias looked at him without surprise. "You've got something for me?" His voice was calm, carrying the rough texture of someone who spent more time around machines than conversations. Noah handed over the electronic signature pad. "Need your signature." Elias signed with steady handwriting. Noah couldn't help glancing through the narrow opening. He expected darkness, dust, broken equipment. Instead, warm amber lights stretched deep into the building. Rows of restored machine tools stood perfectly aligned across polished concrete floors. Massive cast-iron lathes gleamed beneath hanging lamps. Shelves held hundreds of carefully labeled drawers. Wooden workbenches showed fresh tool marks rather than neglect. Nothing looked abandoned. Everything looked alive. Not busy, not commercial. Maintained, loved. Before Noah could focus on anything else, Elias accepted the package. "Thank you." The door closed gently. No explanation, no invitation. Noah stood in the alley for several seconds before returning to his van. The image stayed with him all day. By lunchtime, he found himself wondering why someone would hide a workshop that beautiful, behind windows covered in dust. Inside, Elias carefully opened the package. Nestled inside protective foam was a replacement gear cutter manufactured in Germany. He examined its edges beneath a magnifying lamp. Satisfied, he placed it beside 3 older tools that had clearly been sharpened and repaired countless times rather than replaced. He believed tools deserved respect. People often rushed to buy new ones before understanding the old. Machines weren't so different. The workshop smelled faintly of machine oil, seasoned oak, and cooling steel. Overhead, leather belts connected restored overhead shafts to equipment most museums would have displayed behind glass. Here, they still earned their keep. Each machine had been rebuilt by Elias himself. Some had taken years. Others had been rescued from scrapyards hours before being melted down. Every scratch carried a story. Every repaired bearing represented patience instead of convenience. Near the back wall hung several framed black and white photographs. Factory workers, apprentices, families standing proudly beside finished machinery. It remained that way. Every morning, every evening, always. Elias never explained why. Later that afternoon, Noah mentioned the workshop while grabbing coffee. "You ever been inside Mercer Precision?" The waitress laughed softly. "You mean the ghost shop?" "I don't think it's empty." An older customer looked up from his newspaper. "It isn't." The room grew quiet, not dramatically, but with the natural pause that comes when someone speaks from experience. "I apprenticed there 40 years ago." "Seriously?" The man nodded. "Best machinists in 3 counties. What happened?" The old man stirred his coffee for a long moment before answering. "Life happened." He offered nothing more. Noah sensed there was a larger story, but the man returned to his newspaper, as if the conversation had already reached its proper ending. Sometimes silence protects memories better than words. That evening, rain drifted over the neighborhood, soft enough to blur the streetlights without washing away the dust. Across the road, people hurried home with umbrellas tilted against the wind. Behind the faded windows of Mercer Precision Works, warm lights still glowed, hidden from nearly everyone. Elias stood over a workbench where a small brass mechanism rested beneath an inspection lamp. He adjusted it by less than the thickness of a sheet of paper. Tested it. Listened. Adjusted again. Satisfied, he smiled almost imperceptibly. Outside, a dark SUV rolled slowly past the workshop before stopping at the curb. A woman stepped out, perhaps in her early 50s, wearing a charcoal overcoat still damp from the rain. She didn't approach the front door immediately. Instead, she stood on the sidewalk, studying the old building as though recognizing an old friend changed by time. From her pocket, she removed a small brass key. Its worn edges caught the glow from the street lamp. She turned it once in her fingers, then quietly slipped it back into her coat. Without knocking, without trying the lock, she returned to the SUV and drove away into the rain. Inside the workshop, Elias never looked up. He had no idea someone had just come searching for a place the rest of the town believed had been empty for years. Chapter 2. The machines remember what people forgot. Rain lingered over the neighborhood through the night, leaving the streets washed clean by morning. Puddles reflected old brick buildings and telephone wires that sagged gently between weathered utility poles. The faded sign above Mercer Precision Works looked no newer than it had the day before. But behind its worn facade, the workshop had already been awake for hours. Elias stood beside a century-old engine lathe, checking the alignment of its carriage with a dial indicator. The needle barely moved. He nodded to himself, wiped the tool clean with a soft cotton cloth, and returned it to the exact drawer from which it came. Every tool had a place. Every measurement had a reason. The routine wasn't habit alone, it was respect. A quiet knock echoed through the side entrance. "Just patient." Elias opened the door to find the same woman from the previous evening, standing beneath a gray umbrella. Up close, she looked tired rather than wealthy. Her coat was neatly tailored, but the cuffs showed signs of frequent travel. She carried a weatherproof tube filled with rolled engineering drawings, and a worn leather satchel that had clearly seen years of use. "I'm looking for Elias Mercer." "You found him." She offered a small smile. "My name is Claire Donnelly." He waited. "I was hoping you'd give me 10 minutes. I don't usually take meetings." "I know." She glanced toward the workshop without trying to look inside. "That's why I drove 6 hours instead of making a phone call." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the alley pavement. Finally, Elias stepped aside. 10 minutes. Claire paused just inside the doorway. She had expected a well-kept machine shop. She had not expected this. The workshop stretched farther than the building's exterior suggested. Heavy cast-iron machines stood in orderly rows beneath warm industrial lamps. Leather drive belts hung overhead, motionless for the moment. Every bench was clean. Every measuring instrument rested inside fitted wooden cases. The air carried the comforting scent of machine oil, hardwood shavings, and warm steel. It didn't feel like entering a business. It felt like entering a place where time had chosen to slow down. Claire noticed something unusual. None of the machines had decorative ropes or museum plaques. They weren't preserved. They were working. You've kept them running. Elias simply replied, "Machines don't mind getting older. They mind being neglected." Claire carefully removed a bundle of engineering drawings from her satchel. She spread them across a broad oak workbench whose surface bore decades of careful use. The blueprints were faded. Some corners had been repaired with yellowed tape. "We're restoring the Red Valley Hydroelectric Station," she said. "Our team has rebuilt almost everything. Turbines, generators, control systems." She stopped before continuing. "Except one." She placed a heavy steel assembly on the bench. At first glance it looked ordinary, a governor linkage worn smooth by nearly 90 years of operation. This failed during testing. Elias examined it without touching. Claire continued. "We've commissioned 5 manufacturers." She unfolded photographs beside the part. "Each replica failed within hours." She hesitated. "We scanned the original." She slid another page forward. "Digitally modeled every surface." Another page. "Even recreated it with aerospace-grade alloys." Still nothing. Elias finally picked up the component. Its weight settled naturally into his hands. He rotated it beneath the workshop lights, silent, listening, feeling, as though the metal itself had something left to say. "You've already answered your own question," he said quietly. Claire frowned. "I don't understand." "You copied the shape." He looked toward her, but not the thinking. She remained silent. He carried the mechanism toward an inspection lamp and positioned a magnifying lens above it. Tiny scratches appeared across the worn steel. Not damage, tool marks. Old ones, made by hand. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "You see these?" Claire leaned closer. "I thought they were wear." "They aren't." Elias reached for a sharpened pencil. The original builder finished this surface after installation. He traced several nearly invisible arcs. The blueprint couldn't record that. Claire stared. Our scanners missed it. They wouldn't see intention. She looked back at the photographs. Every failed reproduction had copied the official drawing perfectly. Perfectly wrong. For the first time that morning, Claire allowed herself to ask the question she'd driven 6 hours to ask. "Will you help us?" Elias didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the rear of the workshop. There, hanging on a brick wall, was an old framed photograph. 2 young men stood beside a massive industrial press. Both smiled into the camera, sleeves rolled to their elbows, faces streaked with grease. One was unmistakably a younger Elias. The other, Claire didn't recognize him. "My brother, Daniel." His voice was calm, but softer than before. "We worked together." He looked at the photograph for a long moment. "Until the accident." The words settled quietly between them. "There was an equipment failure?" Elias shook his head. "No." Another pause. "A rushed repair." Nothing more. He didn't describe the day. He didn't explain the loss. He simply turned the framed face forward again. After that, he glanced around the workshop, as stopped building for factories. Claire finally understood. The workshop wasn't hidden because business had failed. It had become a promise, a place where nothing would ever be rushed again. She rolled up the blueprints. "I won't pressure you." She slipped the damaged governor back into its protective case. "I only wanted the chance to ask." Elias walked her toward the side entrance. Just before she reached the door, he spoke. "When does the station reopen?" "If we can't solve this," she smiled sadly. "It won't." He nodded once. "Leave the part." Her eyebrows lifted. "I'll look at it." "That's all?" "For now." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal anymore. The following evening, long after darkness settled over Mercer Street, faint mechanical sounds drifted once again from behind the faded windows. Only this time, they continued well past midnight. The steady rhythm of a precision grinder, the slow rotation of a dividing head, the delicate scrape of a hand scraper fitting 2 steel surfaces until they met without resistance. Across the street, Noah finished his delivery route and happened to pass by. He noticed something different. Light spilled beneath the large front doors. Not much, just enough to reveal shadows moving across the floor inside. Curious, he slowed his van. Then he heard it. The deep metallic click of an enormous machine coming to life. Not struggling, not roaring, working exactly as it had been built to decades ago. Noah sat quietly behind the steering wheel, watching the narrow strip of warm light beneath the doors. He had the unmistakable feeling that something important was happening inside the forgotten workshop. He just didn't yet know that by the end of the week, those doors, which the town hadn't seen fully opened in nearly 20 years, would reveal a legacy that had never truly disappeared. Chapter 3. When the doors finally opened. The first person to notice was the florist across the street. Just after sunrise, she paused while arranging buckets of fresh flowers outside her shop. A low mechanical hum drifted across the quiet street, not loud but steady, carrying the unmistakable rhythm of heavy machinery. She looked up. The wide steel doors of Mercer Precision Works were open, not halfway, completely, for the first time in nearly 20 years. The workshop, hidden behind dusty windows and fading brick, stood exposed to the morning light. Inside, rows of restored machines stretched toward the back wall like patient giants, waking from a long sleep. Sunlight poured through the open entrance, catching tiny particles of dust that floated above polished cast iron. Brass fittings glowed with a warm golden tone. Wooden workbenches carried the smooth shine that only decades of careful use could create. People slowed as they walked past. Some stopped altogether. They weren't staring because the machines looked expensive. They were staring because nothing inside matched the neglected building they had passed for years. No piles of scrap, no abandoned equipment, no decay. Only order, only care. Noah parked his delivery van on the opposite side of the street. He crossed carefully, almost feeling as though he were entering a place where loud voices didn't belong. Elias was guiding a heavy cast-iron indexing machine toward the doorway, using nothing more than a pallet jack and deliberate patience. Every movement was slow, calculated, and unhurried. "You could have asked someone to help," Noah said. Elias smiled faintly. "I usually do. I don't see anyone." "The machine." Noah laughed quietly before realizing Elias wasn't joking. "You don't force old equipment," Elias continued. "You learn how it wants to move." Together, without another word, they eased the machine into the sunlight. It settled onto its new position with barely a sound. Across the street, several people who had once joked about the workshop watched in silence, not embarrassed, not ashamed, simply surprised by how wrong their assumptions had been. An hour later, Claire arrived. She stepped out of her SUV carrying a wooden crate lined with protective foam. Inside rested the newly completed Governor Assembly. Its surface wasn't polished to impress anyone. Fine tool marks remained visible, each one placed with intention. It looked like a component built to work, not to be displayed. "The installation is tomorrow," Claire said. Elias nodded. "No photographers?" She smiled. "You specifically requested there wouldn't be." "Good. What if it works?" He shrugged. "Then it was worth making. No speeches, no celebration, only another day's work." The hydroelectric station stood beside a fast-moving river nearly 200 miles away. Engineers gathered around the restored control system as the Governor Assembly was lowered into position. Most of them had spent months trying to solve the problem through advanced software, precision scanners, and computer simulations. Now they watched an old-fashioned hand-finished component disappear inside a machine built generations earlier. Claire tightened the final bolts herself. The room filled with the quiet sounds of preparation, checklists, pressure readings, radio confirmations. Then the operator looked toward her. "Ready?" She inhaled slowly. "Start it." The turbine began to turn. Water rushed through steel gates deep below the building. The generator climbed steadily toward operating speed. 1 minute passed, then another. The governor adjusted smoothly, correcting tiny fluctuations almost before the instruments could register them. No vibration, no hesitation, no failure. An older maintenance supervisor smiled to himself. "I haven't heard it run this smoothly in 30 years. There was no cheering. Instead, people simply kept watching the monitors, almost reluctant to believe that the problem had finally been solved. Some successes announce themselves with noise, others are measured by the absence of it. Back in Mercer Street, Elias was sweeping metal shavings into a dustpan when Claire called. It worked. He rested the broom against the workbench. I'm glad. They want to recognize you publicly. No. They'd like to name the restoration after your contribution. No. Claire laughed softly. I thought you'd say that. She ended the call after thanking him once more. Elias slipped his phone back into his pocket and finished sweeping the floor. Over the following weeks, something unexpected began happening. Young people started arriving. Not tourists, not reporters. Students from the community college, apprentice welders, mechanical engineering graduates. A high school teacher brought a small group of teenagers who had never seen a manual lathe outside a history book. Most expected a museum tour. Instead, Elias handed them cleaning cloths. If you're going to learn machines, he said, you start by respecting them. One teenager looked disappointed. We're just cleaning? Elias nodded. You notice more with your hands than with your eyes. By the end of the afternoon, that same student could identify different metals by touch alone. Lessons rarely began where people expected. One rainy evening, while reorganizing an old storage cabinet, Noah discovered a wooden box tucked behind stacks of carefully labeled patterns. Inside lay dozens of unopened envelopes. Each carried Elias's name. Some were decades old. He brought the box to the workbench. I think these are yours. Elias looked genuinely puzzled. I thought I'd answered all my mail. The oldest envelope had yellowed with age. He opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter from a former apprentice. The bearing technique you taught me prevented a failure that could have injured 3 workers. I never thanked you properly. Another came from a factory owner. Your advice saved our production line, after everyone else told us to replace the machine. Another. I still teach your measuring method to every apprentice who joins our shop. Then another, and another. For nearly an hour, Elias read quietly. He had spent years believing people had forgotten the workshop. The letters revealed something different. People had remembered. They had simply respected his decision to live in peace. No applause could have carried more weight than those handwritten pages. Autumn arrived. The graffiti on the side wall disappeared beneath fresh brickwork, repaired by volunteers from the neighborhood. The faded sign remained. Elias refused to replace it. It earned those years, he said. One crisp morning, Noah arrived before sunrise. He unlocked the workshop as Elias prepared coffee. Without speaking, Elias reached into a drawer and removed an old brass measuring caliper. Its handles were polished smooth from decades of use. My brother's, he said quietly. He placed it into Noah's toolbox. Noah looked up. I can't take this. You can. I haven't earned it. Elias smiled. You're still here. Noah understood. The tool wasn't a reward. It was trust. Outside, the first rays of sunlight reached the open workshop doors. Neighbors walked past on their way to work, many offering small waves instead of curious glances. The building had become part of the street again, not because it had changed, but because people had finally taken the time to see it. The machines continued their steady rhythm, filling the morning with the comforting sound of skilled hands at work. Elias stood beside the doorway for a moment, watching the neighborhood come to life. Years earlier, he had believed that closing the doors was the only way to protect what mattered. Now he understood something different. Knowledge survives only when it is shared. He turned back toward the workshop where Noah was already preparing the day's work. Ready? Elias asked. Noah smiled. Always. Together they switched on the first machine of the morning. Its familiar hum rolled gently through the old brick building and out into the waking street, not as a monument to the past, but as a promise that craftsmanship, patience, and quiet dignity would continue long after both men were gone. And for the people who passed Mercer Precision Works each morning, the old workshop was no longer the forgotten building everyone had mocked. It had become a reminder that the strongest things are often the ones that keep working in silence long after the world stops paying attention. Chapter 4. The Hands That Carried It Forward. Winter arrived quietly on Mercer Street. The first frost settled over the rooftops before dawn, outlining every brick and window frame in pale silver. Inside Mercer Precision Works, however, The warmth never came from heaters alone. It came from the steady rhythm of work, the hum of electric motors, the soft scrape of a file against steel, and the occasional burst of laughter that had become more common over the past few months. The workshop no longer belonged to silence. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, a handful of apprentices gathered around Elias's main workbench. There were no whiteboards, no projectors, and no printed lesson plans. Instead, each student received a worn notebook, a sharpened pencil, and a block of raw steel. "Before you build anything," Elias would say, "learn how to observe." The first lesson wasn't cutting metal, it was watching. For nearly 20 minutes, no one spoke. The students watched how Elias picked up a measuring tool, how he cleaned its jaws before using it, and how he checked the same dimension twice, not because he doubted himself, but because he respected the material. At first, some found the pace frustrating. Noah remembered feeling the same way. He smiled quietly as he watched the newcomers shift impatiently from one foot to the other. He knew what would happen. Eventually, they would understand that the workshop wasn't teaching speed, it was teaching judgment. One snowy afternoon, a teenage apprentice named Mia accidentally ruined a nearly finished brass gear. Her cutting tool slipped only a fraction of a millimeter. It was enough. The gear was useless. She stared at the damaged piece, fighting back tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I wasted it." Elias picked up the gear and turned it slowly beneath the lamp. "You know what this is?" "A mistake." "No." He set it gently on the bench. "It's tuition." Mia looked confused. "You've paid for a lesson," he continued. "Now make sure you don't pay for it twice." He handed her another piece of brass. "Start again." There was no lecture, no disappointment, only another opportunity. The other apprentices noticed something important that day. Elias never judged people by their mistakes. He judged them by what they did next. As word spread, local businesses began bringing unusual repair jobs to the workshop, not because Mercer Precision Works was the cheapest, because it was often the only place willing to repair something everyone else wanted to replace. An elderly farmer arrived carrying the broken gearbox from a grain mill his father had built decades earlier. A small printing company brought in a worn press that modern technicians had declared beyond saving. Even the city museum asked if Elias could restore the clock mechanism from its historic courthouse tower. He accepted only the jobs that mattered. When someone asked why he refused lucrative commercial contracts, he simply replied, "If a machine still has years left in it, it deserves the chance." One afternoon, Claire returned with unexpected news. She placed a folded newspaper on the workbench. The headline featured the successful reopening of the Red Valley Hydroelectric Station. Near the bottom of the article was a short paragraph mentioning an unnamed machinist whose craftsmanship had made the restoration possible. "They respected your wishes," Claire said. Elias read the article before folding it neatly. "They left out my name." "They did. Good." Claire smiled. "You still don't like attention. I like work." She laughed. "I've noticed." Then she reached into her satchel and removed a small wooden plaque. It wasn't an award. It wasn't engraved with his name. Instead, it bore a simple brass plate that read, "Craftsmanship is remembered long after convenience is forgotten." "It belongs here," she said. Elias looked at it for a long moment. Finally, he nodded toward the wall near the entrance. "Hang it where the apprentices can see it." Months later, the town council announced plans to redevelop the old industrial district. Developers proposed modern office buildings and cafes, hoping to attract new businesses. One architectural drawing showed Mercer Precision Works replaced by a glass parking structure. The proposal reached the first public meeting. Before Elias could even stand, neighbors began speaking. The florist described how the workshop had become part of the neighborhood again. The bakery owner explained how apprentices bought breakfast there every morning. The retired machinist who had once trained under Elias held up an old photograph of the workshop from 40 years earlier. Then Noah stepped to the microphone. He wasn't comfortable speaking in public, but he knew some things deserved saying. "When people looked at this building," he began, "they saw old bricks." He paused. "I walked through those doors and found a place that teaches patience, responsibility, and pride in honest work." He looked around the room. "You can build another office anywhere. But once a place like this disappears," he let the sentence trail off. Everyone understood. Weeks later, the redevelopment plans were revised. Mercer Precision Works remained exactly where it had always stood. Not because it was famous, because the community had finally recognized its value. The following spring, the workshop celebrated nothing in particular. No anniversary. No ceremony. Just another ordinary morning. The front doors stood open as sunlight spilled across the worn concrete floor. Noah adjusted a milling machine, while Mia carefully measured a steel shaft at the next bench.
Claire stopped by for coffee before driving to another restoration project.
Elias watched them all from the doorway. Years earlier, he had believed his life's work was hidden inside the machines. Now he knew better. It had never been the lathes, the tools, or even the perfectly machined parts. His real work stood laughing around the benches, solving problems together, asking thoughtful questions, and learning to care about details that most people never noticed. The machines had preserved the past. The people would carry it into the future. Elias quietly switched off the workshop lights before locking up that evening. As he stepped outside, he looked back through the front windows. For the first time in many years, the reflections no longer hid what was inside. They revealed it. And that, he thought with a quiet smile, made all the difference.